Hello friends, myself Dr. Akhilesh, your physiology faculty. In this class, I will discuss the two topics of the GIT. One is the gastric juice secretion, another is gastric emptying. So let us discuss the first topic, that is the gastric juice secretion. So in the gastric juice secretion, I will discuss about the composition of the gastric juice. Then in the composition of the gastric juice, how much is the daily production of the gastric juice? So the daily production of gastric juice is 2.5 to 3 liters per day. So the daily secretion is 2.5 to 3 liters per day. Then what is the pH of the gastric juice? The pH of the gastric juice is, it is from 1 to 2, right? So it may be from 1 to 2. The average pH is 1.2. So average pH of the gastric juice is 1.2. So in some books you will find the pH range from 0.8 to 3.0 also. So then after this, the pH. Now come to this, the electrolytes. So what are the electrolytes present in the gastric juice? So the electrolytes present, they are either cation or the anion. Cations means positively charged ions. So what are the various cations? So cations are, one is the sodium ion, other one is the potassium ion, other one is the hydrogen ion and the magnesium ion, right? Remember that the calcium ion is not present in the gastric juice, right? So this calcium ion is absent in the gastric juice, right? And the concentration of the sodium ion, it depends upon the rate of secretion of the gastric juice. So when the gastric juice secretion rate is low, the concentration of sodium ion is high and the concentration of hydrogen ion is low. But when the rate of gastric juice secretion is high, then the sodium ion concentration will fall and the concentration of hydrogen ion will rise, right? So what I told you here that at low secretory rate, so when the secretory rate of the gastric juice is low, the concentration of the sodium ion is high and the concentration of hydrogen ion is low, right? And when the secretory rate is high, so at high secretory rate, then the concentration of sodium ion will fall and the concentration of hydrogen ion will rise, right? So the concentration of the sodium ion fall, right? And concentration of the hydrogen ion rises, right? So this is about the cation. Then in the anions, what are the various anions present in the gastric juice? The various anions, they are, one is the chloride anion, other one is the bicarbonate anion, other one is the phosphate anion, and other one is sulfate anion. So chloride anion, then the bicarbonate anion, then the phosphate anion, then the sulfate anions, right? These are the various anions present in the gastric juice. Then what are the enzymes present in the gastric juice? The various enzymes present in the gastric juice, they are, one is pepsinogen, then other one is the gelatinase, then gastric lipase, then the lysozymes, right? And regarding the pepsinogen, the pepsinogen is the inactive form of the pepsin. The pepsin is a protein digesting enzyme present in the gastric juice. So this pepsinogen is converted into the active form pepsin by the acidic pH, and this acidic pH is provided by the HCl. So this gastric acid will provide the acidic pH, and this acidic pH it will activate the pepsinogen to the pepsin, and this pepsin will break down the protein which will enter into the stomach, right? Then the gastric juice also contain the Cassell's intrinsic factor. So this Cassell's intrinsic factor is required for absorption of vitamin B12 from the ileum, right? So this is required for absorption of vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 from the ileum, right? So this is the importance of the Cassell's intrinsic factor, right? Then after this, the composition of the gastric juice. Now we discuss about what are the various mechanisms of secretion of the gastric acid. Gastric acid is also called as the HCl. So how this acid HCl is secreted by the gland in the stomach, right? So this HCl is secreted by the oxyntic cell, or also called as the parietal cell in the stomach, right? So in this, the parietal cell, there is a pump. So this pump is called as the potassium hydrogen ATPase, also called as potassium hydrogen pump, also called as proton pump. So this hydrogen potassium ATPase, so the name of this pump is the potassium hydrogen ATPase. It is also called as the potassium hydrogen pump. It is also called as the proton pump, right? So this pump, it will pump the hydrogen out of the oxyntic cell into the canaliculus of the parietal cell, right? So it will pump the hydrogen from the parietal cell into the canaliculus of the oxyntic cell. So this hydrogen will come out, and this is in exchange of the potassium ion. So this potassium ion will enter into the parietal cell or the oxyntic cell, and the potassium it will be again secreted into the canaliculus of the oxyntic cell, right? So what is the source of this hydrogen in the parietal cell? So this hydrogen is derived from the reaction between the carbon dioxide and water. So carbon dioxide, it will combine with the water in the presence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. The short form is Ca. So the Ca means what enzyme? The Ca means carbonic anhydrase. So in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, the carbon dioxide will combine with the water to form H2CO3, that is the carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid, again in the presence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase, it is broken down into the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ions. So this hydrogen ion is secreted into the canaliculus of this parietal cell, right? And the bicarbonate ion which is produced here, it will be pumped into the interstitium, and this bicarbonate will enter into the bloodstream, right? And when the bicarbonate is pumped out of this, the parietal cell through the basolateral membrane, then there is entry of chloride simultaneously through the antiporter called as bicarbonate chloride antiporter. So when the bicarbonate will go out, then the chloride ion, it will enter into the parietal cell, and this chloride ion is, it will be secreted into the canaliculus of the parietal cell, and this chloride ion, it will combine with the hydrogen ion to form HCl, that is the gastric acid, right? Then the water will enter into the parietal cell from the interstitium, and this water is also secreted into the canaliculus of the parietal cell, right? And this secretion, that is the HCl and the water, they are secreted into the stomach. So this is how the gastric acid or HCl is secreted into the secreted by the parietal cells into the stomach, right? And the parietal cell is surrounded by some other cells. So these cells are called as the mucous neck cells. These mucous neck cells, they will produce the mucus into the stomach, right? So this is about the mechanism of secretion of the gastric juice, how the gastric juice is secreted, right? Then the HCl secretion is regulated. So the regulation of the HCl secretion. So let us understand this with the help of the diagram. So here you can see here, this is the diagram showing the structure of the parietal cell. So this cell is the parietal cell, also called as the oxyntic cell. It is also called as the oxyntic cell, right? And this is the lumen of the stomach, and on this the luminal side of the parietal cell, there is a pump, which I already told you. The name of this pump is the potassium hydrogen ATPase, right? So this is a pump. This pump will pump the hydrogen out of the parietal cell and in the exchange of the potassium. So potassium will be thrown back into the parietal cell. So this pump is also called as the proton pump, right? So the secretion of the hydrogen ion is affected by, one is the vagus nerve, right? So this vagus nerve, it will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. This acetylcholine will bind on the M3 cholinergic receptor. Here M stands for what? The muscarinic. So M3 cholinergic receptor. So M3 muscarinic cholinergic receptor. It is a type of acetylcholine receptor. So this M3 cholinergic receptor, it will stimulate one G protein that is called as the GQ protein, and this will lead to formation of IP3. IP3 full form is inositol triphosphate. This inositol triphosphate will cause the release of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum, and this calcium will activate this pump, the hydrogen potassium pump, right? Then the vagus nerve will also stimulate the G cells in the stomach. G cells will produce the hormone gastrin, and this hormone gastrin, it will bind with the cholecystokinin B receptor on the parietal cell, and this cholecystokinin B, it will again stimulate the GQ G protein, and this will act via inositol triphosphate and calcium and to stimulate the potassium hydrogen pump, right? Then the vagus nerve will also stimulate the enterochromaffin like cells. The enterochromaffin like cells, they will produce histamine, and this histamine will stimulate the H2 receptor on the parietal cell, and this H2 receptor, it will act via the another type of the G protein, that is the GS. Here S stands for stimulatory. So here it will act via the G protein, and this will act via the cyclic AMP. So G protein will lead to formation of cyclic AMP, and this cyclic AMP will stimulate the potassium hydrogen pump, right? Then the one hormone is there which is produced from the D cell. So that hormone is called as somatostatin. So this somatostatin, it will stimulate one G protein. that G protein is GI. GI means inhibitory G protein, right? So it will stimulate the inhibitory G protein, and this inhibitory G protein, it will inhibit the formation of cyclic AMP, and it will inhibit the hydrogen ion secretion by the potassium hydrogen pump, right? The somatostatin, it will also inhibit the enterochromaffin cells, right, and inhibit the release of histamine by the enterochromaffin cell, and the somatostatin will also inhibit the G cells and inhibit the secretion of the hormone gastrin from the G cells, right. So the somatostatin, it will decrease the secretion of the hydrogen ion by the parietal cell, right. Then there are prostaglandins. So these prostaglandins, they will bind on the receptor present on the parietal cells, and these prostaglandins, they will also stimulate the inhibitory G protein, and this inhibitory G protein will inhibit the formation of cyclic AMP, and it will decrease the secretion of hydrogen ion, right. So in this you can see here that the vagus nerve, the G cells, the enterochromaffin cells, right. Vagus nerve will release acetylcholine, G cells will release gastrin, and the enterochromaffin like cells will release histamine. So acetylcholine, gastrin, and histamine, they will increase the secretion of the hydrogen ion by the parietal cells, right. So here acetylcholine, then the gastrin, right, then the histamine, the three will increase the hydrogen ion secretion from the parietal cell, right. So they will increase the hydrogen ion secretion by the parietal cell, right. Then the hormone somatostatin, which is produced by the D cell, and the prostaglandins, these two. So they too are going to decrease the hydrogen ion secretion by the parietal cell, right. So they will decrease the hydrogen ion secretion by the parietal cell, right. So this is how the regulation of the HCl secretion is there. So now in this I told you what are the factors which will increase the hydrogen ion secretion, and what are the factors which will decrease the hydrogen ion secretion. So I told you one factor, that is the acetylcholine. So acetylcholine will increase the hydrogen ion secretion, right. Then the hormone gastrin secreted by the G cells, then the histamine secreted by the enterochromaffin like cells, right. Then the hydrogen ion secretion is decreased by, so one is, I told you, the hormone somatostatin, right. Then the prostaglandins, right. So these are the factors which will increase or decrease the secretion of the hydrogen ion, and hence the secretion of the gastric acid, that is the HCl, right. Then in this part, how is the regulation of gastric juice secretion is there. So the gastric juice secretion regulation is by two ways. One is the nervous regulation, right, and other one is the humoral regulation. So in the nervous regulation, there are two things. One is the local autonomic reflexes, right, and other one is the impulses from the central nervous system, right. So impulses from the central nervous system, they will stimulate the vagus nerve, and this vagus nerve will act via three ways. One is the vagus nerve will release a neurotransmitter acetylcholine. This acetylcholine will increase the gastric juice secretion. So it will increase the gastric juice secretion, right. Then other one is the vagus nerve will release the one peptide called as gastrin releasing peptide, right. So this is called as So gastrin releasing peptide, the short form is the GRP, right? So this gastrin releasing peptide, it will stimulate the G cells in the stomach, and this G cells will increase the gastrin secretion. So it will increase the gastrin secretion, right? And this gastrin secretion will lead to increase in the gastric juice, right? So it will increase the gastric juice secretion, right? Then the third way is that the vagus nerve will stimulate the enterochromaffin-like cells, right? These enterochromaffin-like cells will produce the hormone histamine, right? So they will produce histamine, and this histamine will lead to increase in the gastric juice secretion. So it will increase the gastric juice secretion, right? So it will increase the gastric juice secretion. So this is how this nervous regulation of the gastric juice. Now come to this, the humoral regulation of the gastric juice. So in the humoral regulation, there is role of the hormone gastrin, right? So how this gastrin release is there? So one is the gastrin release is by the psychic stimuli. So these psychic stimuli means what? So psychic stimuli means when there is sight of the food, or there is smell of the food, or there is thought of the food, or there is taste of the food, right? So sight of the food, there is smell of the food, then the thought of the food, and there is taste of the food. So these psychic stimuli, they are going to stimulate the vagus nerve, right? And this vagus nerve, it will cause the release of the gastric juice, right? It will cause the direct release of the gastric juice. So direct release of the gastric juice, right? Direct release of the gastric juice. And this vagus nerve will also cause the release of the gastrin. So it will cause the release of the hormone gastrin, and this gastrin will lead to release of gastric juice, right? It will cause the release of the gastric juice, right? So one is the psychic stimuli, the other one is when we eat the food and when this food reaches in the stomach. So meal in the stomach, what it will lead to is, so meal in the stomach, it will lead to the distension of the stomach. So it will lead to the distension of the stomach, right? And this distension of the stomach, it will lead to release of gastrin. So the release of the gastrin by the G cells, right? And this release of the gastrin will lead to what? It will lead to release of gastric juice. So it will lead to release of the gastric juice, right? And the distension of the stomach, it will also cause the release of, it will also cause the stimulation of the vagus nerve, and this vagus nerve will again lead to release of the gastric juice, right? So this is how there is the regulation of the gastric juice, right? Then there is in this topic, there is what are the phases of the gastric juice secretion, right? So gastric juice secretion has three phases. One phase is called as the cephalic phase, other phase is called as the gastric phase, and the third phase is called as the intestinal phase. Right? Cephalic phase means what? The cephalic phase means when the meal, so this is the meal. So when the meal is before the stomach means it can be in the esophagus, it can be in the mouth, it can be outside the mouth also, that it can be in the plate also. Plate means it is the sight of the food or the smell of the food or the thought of the food. Right? They may lead to the secretion of gastric juice. Right? So cephalic means towards the head, so head side. So the meal is before the stomach towards the head side. That is called the cephalic phase. So cephalic phase, it is mediated by the psychic stimuli. So it is mediated by the psychic stimuli, right? So mediated by the psychic stimuli. The cephalic phase. The second one is the gastric phase. Gastric phase is when the meal is in the stomach, right? So meal in the stomach will distend the stomach, and this distension of the stomach will lead to two things. One is the local enteric reflex, other one is the release of the gastrin, right? The third one is the intestinal phase. Intestinal phase means what? When the meal is out of the stomach, right? So out of the stomach means when it will pass through the small intestine, the duodenum and other parts of the small intestine. So this is the intestinal phase. So three phases are there. Out of these three phases, the cephalic phase, it will contribute 20 to 30% of the gastric juice secretion. The gastric phase will contribute approximately 70% of the gastric juice secretion, and the intestinal phase will contribute only 10% of the gastric juice secretion. So out of these three, who contribute maximum to the gastric juice secretion? So out of these three, the gastric phase, it will contribute maximum to the gastric juice secretion. So let me describe these three phases one by one. So coming to the first one, that is the cephalic phase. So as I told you, the cephalic phase is when the food is before the stomach, right? Before the stomach, it can be in the esophagus or the mouth or outside the mouth also. That is the various psychic stimuli. For example, the sight of the food, for example, the smell of the food, for example, the thought of the food, for example, the taste of the food, right? So these psychic stimuli, so they all are the psychic stimuli. So these psychic stimuli, they are going to stimulate the vagus nerve, right? So they will stimulate the vagus nerve, and this vagus nerve will lead to what? Release of the gastric juice, right? So this will lead to release of the gastric juice, right? So remember, in the cephalic phase, the two things here, one is the psychic stimuli and other one is the vagus nerve. So remember about the psychic stimuli and remember about the vagus nerve in the cephalic phase. And as I told you, this cephalic phase will contribute how much to the gastric juice secretion? So it will contribute 20 to 30% of the gastric juice secretion, right? So 20 to 30% of the gastric juice secretion, right? And since here is involvement of the vagus nerve, so therefore this is also called as the neural phase of the gastric juice secretion, right? So this phase is also called as the neural phase of gastric juice secretion. So neural phase of gastric juice secretion, right? So remember the third thing here, this is also called as the neural phase of gastric juice secretion. So neural phase, right? So in the cephalic phase, remember psychic stimuli, remember vagus nerve, remember neural phase, remember 20 to 30% of gastric juice secretion. Then the second phase of the gastric juice secretion is the gastric phase. So gastric phase is what? There is meal is in the stomach. So meal in the stomach will lead to distension of the stomach. So meal is in the stomach, and this meal in the stomach, it will lead to distension of the stomach. So it will lead to distension of the stomach, and this distension of the stomach, it will lead to two things. One is it will set up the local enteric reflexes. So local enteric reflexes, and these enteric reflexes will lead to the release of the gastric juice, right? And the second thing is it will lead to the release of the hormone gastrin, right? So release of the hormone gastrin, right? And this gastrin will lead to release of the gastric juice. So gastrin also and the local enteric reflexes also, they will lead to release of the gastric juice, right? And so in the gastric phase of the gastric juice secretion, it will contribute approximately 70% of the gastric juice secretion, right? So it will contribute 70% of the gastric juice secretion. And since here there is involvement of the hormone gastrin, so this phase is also called as the hormonal phase of gastric juice secretion. So hormonal phase of the gastric juice secretion, right? We also call that the hormonal phase of gastric juice secretion, right? So hormonal phase of the gastric juice secretion. Right. So remember, in the gastric phase of the gastric juice secretion, remember the following things. Number one is, right, so there is one is the local enteric reflexes. Second is you have to remember the hormone gastrin. The third thing you have to remember here, it is also called as the hormonal phase. And the fourth thing you have to remember, it will contribute the 70% of the gastric juice secretion, and this 70% is the maximum, right? The maximum secretion of the gastric juice is in the gastric phase of the gastric juice secretion, right? So the third phase is the intestinal phase. So I will write here the maximum word here. So the maximum is 70% of the gastric juice secretion is in the gastric phase. The third phase is the intestinal phase of the gastric juice secretion. Intestinal phase means when the meal is after the stomach, that is in the duodenum or in the small other parts of the small intestine. So this intestinal phase, it is a purely reflex mediated. It is purely reflex mediated, right? And in this reflex, the neurotransmitter involved is the peptide YY. Right. So peptide YY is the neurotransmitter involved in this reflex. So peptide YY, so peptide YY is the neurotransmitter involved in this reflex. Right. The neurotransmitter involved in this reflex. Right. So these are the three phases of the gastric juice secretion. Right. And this is about the gastric juice secretion. Then we come to the next part in the today's class, that is the gastric emptying. right? So in the gastric emptying, what we have to know is that what we mean by the gastric emptying and what are the factors which affect the gastric emptying, and who will increase the gastric emptying and who will decrease the gastric emptying. So to understand the gastric emptying, you have to know about the one term called as basic electrical rhythm. The basic electrical rhythm, in short form, it is also called as the BER. It is also called as the gastric flow wave, right? It is also called as the gastric flow wave. So gastric flow wave, they are the a wave of depolarization of smooth muscles of the stomach, right? So these BER or gastric flow wave, they are what? So they are the wave of depolarization of smooth muscles in the stomach, right? So smooth muscles in the stomach. So smooth muscles in the stomach, right? So this basic electrical rhythm or the BER, it will originate from the interstitial cells of Cajal. The interstitial cells of Cajal, they are also called as the pacemaker cells. These pacemaker cells are present in the circular smooth muscle layer near the junction of the fundus and the body on the greater curvature. So in this diagram, you can see here, so this is the location of the interstitial cells of Cajal. So they are present in the circular smooth muscle, right? So they will initiate the basic electrical rhythm, and this basic electrical rhythm is what? Wave of depolarization. So depolarization will lead to the depolarization of the smooth muscle, and the depolarization of smooth muscle will lead to the contraction of this smooth muscle, right? So this contraction of the smooth muscle at this fundus it is approximately 1 centimeter in 1 second, right? And this contraction wave, they will increase as we move from fundus to the body and body to the antrum, right? So as this contraction will come down, so it will increase. So here near the antrum, this contraction is approximately 4 centimeter in 1 second. So 4 centimeter per second, right? And these contractions, they take place in approximately every 20 seconds, right? So these contractions every 20 seconds means there are 3 contractions in 1 minute. So the rate of this contraction formation is approximately 3 contractions in 1 minute. So there will be 3 contractions, approximately 3 contractions in 1 minute in the stomach, right? So these contractions, they are also called as the peristaltic contractions in the stomach. So then who will increase this contraction waves in the stomach and who will decrease the contractions waves in the stomach? So these contractions waves, they are increased by, one is the hormone gastrin, then the histamine, then the acetylcholine, then nicotine, right, then the barium, right, and the potassium ion, they will increase these contractions, right? And these contractions, they are inhibited by, one is the epinephrine, other one is norepinephrine, right, and other one is atropine and the calcium. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, norepinephrine, atropine, and the calcium, right? So they will inhibit these contractions in the stomach, right? Then in this part of the gastric emptying, so how this gastric emptying takes place, that when the food will enter into the esophagus, and after entering the esophagus, it will pass to the stomach, right? So food enters from the esophagus into the stomach by a process which is called as the receptive relaxation of the stomach. So when food will enter in the stomach, there will be the relaxation of the stomach and the food will enter into the stomach. So, right, how this receptive relaxation is there. So this receptive relaxation in the stomach is by when food enters the stomach, so the food in the stomach, it will stretch the receptors present in the stomach. So it will stimulate the stretch receptors present in the stomach. Right. And these stretch receptors, they will initiate vagal reflex in the stomach, and this vagal reflex will lead to the receptive relaxation of the stomach. Right. So it will lead to receptive relaxation of the stomach. So we can use the word here, add the word receptive relaxation. So it will lead to receptive relaxation of the stomach. So receptive relaxation of the stomach. Right. So by this way, the food will enter into the stomach. So then after entering the food into the stomach, this food will be broken down into the smaller size. It will broken down into small size, and this small size food particle, the small size food particles, they are converted into the from solid to semi-solid or into the paste, and the semi-solid food particle which is small in size, this is called as the chyme. Right. So this, the food in the stomach, which is a mixture of the liquid and solid. So this is the mixture of liquid and solid. This will be broken down into the semi-fluid or the paste-like structure. Right. So it will be broken down into the semi-fluid or the paste-like structure, which is also called as the chyme. Right. By the vigorous movement of the stomach. So this chyme is semi-fluid or the paste. Right. Semi-fluid or the paste, and this chyme will pass through the pylorus and will leave the stomach. It will pass through the pylorus of the stomach and it will leave the stomach and enter into the duodenum. Right. So when the food particles, they are converted into the chyme, then only they will leave the stomach. Right. Then what are the mechanisms that prevent the entry of the unbroken or the solid food particles into the duodenum? Right. So remember this, that till the food particle is not converted into the chyme, it will not pass into the stomach. Right. So the solid mass is prevented from entering into the stomach. Right. So this, how it is done here, and how the food do not go back into the stomach after entering the duodenum. So this also we'll discuss here. So what is the cause of this gastric emptying? So this gastric emptying results from the progressive wave of contraction from the fundus to the body, to the antrum, to the pylorus, and to the duodenum, right? So there is a progressive and sequential contraction of the various parts of the stomach which results in the gastric emptying. This gastric emptying results from the progressive waves of contraction, right, which is in a sequential fashion or sequential manner. So sequentially involving, right, the antrum, the pylorus, and duodenum. So antrum, pylorus, and duodenum, right? So there is sequential contraction in the stomach, right? So this the sequential contraction will emptying the chyme from the stomach into the duodenum. Then how is the solid mass prevented from entering into the duodenum, right? So this solid mass will not enter the duodenum, right, till it is converted into the chyme. So how this solid mass is prevented from entering into the duodenum, right? So this solid mass is prevented from entering the duodenum. So it is prevented from entering the duodenum. So what happens is that the when the so when the food it will enter into the stomach, right? This food will be broken down into the chyme, and it will convert into the semifluid, and this semifluid will pass through the pylorus to the duodenum. But if this is not broken down into the chyme, or it is in the solid form, so what happens is that ahead of this, the food solid mass of the food, ahead of this the pylorus will contract, right? So ahead of this the pylorus will contract, and it will prevent the entering of this solid mass from entering into the duodenum, right? So this the contraction of the pylorus, which is ahead of this the solid mass, it will not allow to pass it through the pylorus. So only till this large food mass is converted into the liquid, it will not pass to the pylorus, right? So to pass to the pylorus, it is required that the large food particle is converted into the chyme, then only it will pass through the duodenum, right? So this solid mass is prevented from entering the duodenum because of the contraction ahead of ahead of of contraction ahead of the advancing gastric content. So contraction of the area which is ahead of the gastric content, right? So contraction of the area which is ahead of the gastric content, right? So contraction of the area, right, which is ahead of the gastric content, ahead of the gastric content which is advancing. So it is ahead of the advancing gastric content, right. So the area which is ahead of this gastric content, it will contract and will prevent the passage of this gastric content into the duodenum, right. So this is how this is prevented. Then how this the when the food or the chyme which entered duodenum is not go back into the stomach again. So how this the regurgitation of the chyme from the duodenum is prevented from entering into the stomach back, right. So prevention of regurgitation from duodenum is due to, so this I will explain with the help of diagram. So this is due to prevention of this regurgitation from duodenum is due to is that what happens is that when the chyme will enter into the duodenum, so when the chyme will enter into the duodenum, right, so what will happen is the area behind this chyme, that is the pylorus, right. So this pylorus, the pyloric contraction, so this pyloric contraction will last longer than the contraction of the duodenum, right. So the contraction of this pylorus, which is longer than the contraction of duodenum, so this longer contraction of this the pylorus, it will prevent the entry of or regurgitation of the duodenal chyme into the pylorus or the stomach, right. So this is due to the longer contraction of the pyloric segment, right, than that of duodenum. So than the duodenum, right. So this pyloric contraction will last longer than that of the duodenal contraction. So this it will prevent the entry of the this duodenal chyme into the stomach, right. So this is how this is prevented. So it is also prevented by entering into the stomach by the release of the two hormones. One is the cholecystokinin and the secretin, right. What happens is when the duodenum this chyme will reach the duodenum, then this will cause the release of the hormone cholecystokinin, and it will also cause the release of the hormone secretin, right. So this secretin and the cholecystokinin, they will lead to the contraction of the pylorus, right, and they will close the pyloric sphincter. So this chyme will again not go back into the stomach, right. So second factor is the action of the cholecystokinin and the hormone secretin on the pyloric sphincter, right. So what they will do on the pyloric sphincter, they will lead to the constriction of or closure of this pyloric sphincter, right. So they will close the pyloric sphincter, or they will lead to, you can also say that they will lead to contraction of the pyloric sphincter, and so this food will not enter back into the stomach, right. So these are two ways how there is prevention of the regurgitation from the duodenum, right. Then how is the rate of gastric emptying affected? So this rate of the gastric emptying depend upon the two things. One is the gastric factors and other one is the duodenal factors, right. So the rate of gastric emptying depend upon two factors. One is gastric factor, other one is duodenal factors. The gastric factors, they will increase the gastric emptying. So they will increase the gastric emptying, and the duodenal factors, they will decrease the gastric emptying. Right. So they will decrease the gastric emptying. So what are the gastric factors? So in the gastric factors, it is the volume of the liquid meal in the stomach, right? So what happens is, when there is increase in the volume of the liquid meal in the stomach, right? So volume of the liquid meal in the stomach, the volume of liquid meal in the stomach, right? So this volume of the meal in the stomach, it will distend the stomach. It will distend the stomach, and this distension of the stomach, it will increase the radius of the stomach, right? It will increase the radius of the stomach. Since the stomach is a hollow viscous, it will increase the radius of the stomach, right? And this will lead to application of the law of Laplace in the stomach, and it will increase the tension on the wall of the stomach, right? So tension on the wall of the stomach, right? And it will lead to what? It will lead to the contraction of the wall of the stomach, right? So it will increase the contraction of the wall of the stomach, and it will lead to the gastric emptying, right? And it will increase the gastric emptying, right? So this is how the gastric factor, it will increase the gastric emptying. So remember here is the law of, here is the application of law of the Laplace law, right? So what is the law of Laplace? So Laplace law. So Laplace law will say that the tension on the tension on the wall of the hollow viscous, right? So tension on the wall of the hollow viscous, it will be proportionate to the radius of the hollow viscous, right? Radius r. The tension on the wall will be proportionate to the radius r, right? So tension is the tension on the wall, right? Here the wall is of the stomach, and radius is the radius of the stomach, right? So more radius, the more tension will be there. More tension will be there means what? The more powerful contraction will be there, and this will lead to the gastric emptying. Right. So it will lead to the gastric emptying. Then what are the duodenal factors? So what are the duodenal factors? अंदर है ना, कनेक्शन लॉस्ट हो गया. Then what are the uh, duodenal factors that affect the gastric emptying? So duodenal factors, they inhibit the gastric emptying. One duodenal factor is the protein digestion products in the duodenum and the acid in the duodenum, right? So the protein digestion products in the duodenum and the acid in the duodenum, what they will do is they will stimulate the duodenal mucosa receptors. So they will stimulate the duodenal mucosa receptors. So they will stimulate the duodenal mucosa receptors, right? And these duodenal mucosa receptors, they will initiate a reflex, and this reflex is the neural mediated reflex. This is a neural mediated reflex, and this will decrease the gastric emptying. So this will decrease the gastric emptying, and this reflex is also called as enterogastric reflex, right? So this is also called as the enterogastric reflex. Enterogastric reflex means when the content will enter into the duodenum, so this content will, content in the duodenum, it will inhibit the gastric emptying, right? This is called as enterogastric reflex. Then the second duodenal factor is the size of the duodenal osmoreceptors, which will depend upon the type of the chyme, whether it is the hypoosmolar chyme or whether it is the hyperosmolar chyme. What happens is the hypoosmolar chyme in the duodenum. So this hypoosmolar chyme in the duodenum, they will lead to distension of the osmoreceptors in the, so distension of the osmoreceptors in the stomach, right? And this distension of osmoreceptors, they will lead to the mild inhibition of gastric emptying. This will lead to mild inhibition of the gastric emptying, right? So distension of the osmoreceptors in the duodenum, this will lead to mild inhibition of the gastric emptying, right? But if the chyme is hyperosmolar, so when the chyme is hyperosmolar chyme, then this hyperosmolar chyme in the duodenum, what it will lead to? It will lead to the shrinkage of the osmoreceptors in the duodenum. The shrinkage of the osmoreceptors in the duodenum, and this, the duodenum, so shrinkage of osmoreceptors in the duodenum, right? And this shrinkage of the osmoreceptors in the duodenum, what they will lead to? They will lead to the marked inhibition of gastric emptying. So there is marked inhibition of the gastric emptying. right? So the time which is hyperosmolar, it will take a longer time to pass through the stomach, right? Because its gastric emptying is very slow. And if the time is hypoosmolar, it will uh, pass relatively easier from the stomach, right? Then the other factor is the type of the ingested food, right? So this, the rate of the gastric emptying depend upon the type of the food we ingest, right? So this gastric emptying rate, it will depend upon the type of the food we ingest, and if the food is carbohydrate in carbohydrate, right, it will leave the stomach very fast. So its gastric emptying is the fastest, right? Then the food which is rich in the protein, right? Then the food which is rich in the fat. So the food which is rich in the fat, it has the slowest gastric emptying, right? The slowest gastric emptying. So therefore, what happens is that if we want to prevent the alcohol intoxication, so what we do is that uh, before the consumption of the alcohol, the person is advised to take fat-rich drink, for example, milk or this cream, right? So fat in the if the person consume the fat-rich drink before consumption of alcohol, so this fat will not allow the alcohol to leave the stomach and enter into the duodenum, right? So the entry of the alcohol into the duodenum and the other part of the small intestine will be slow, so its absorption will be also slower absorption. So by this way, the alcohol intoxication is prevented, right? So this, let us write this. So alcohol intoxication, so alcohol intoxication can be avoided if it is consumed after ingestion of if it is consumed after ingestion of so if it is consumed after ingestion of fat rich, so after consumption of after ingestion of fat rich drinks, right? The example of such fat rich drinks are, for example, milk, for example, cream, etc., right? So these fat rich drinks, they will slowly pass through the stomach, and so also the alcohol will also pass slowly out of the stomach, and so this the absorption of alcohol will be very slow. So by this way, we can prevent from the alcohol intoxication. Then the other factors which will affect the gastric emptying, they are the miscellaneous factors. For example, the gastric emptying is inhibited by the hormone gastric inhibiting peptide, right? The hormone cholecystokinin, the hormone secretin, right? So these hormones, they are also called as enterogastrons. They are also called as enterogastrons. gastrons, right? And the gastric emptying is also inhibited by the removal of the vagus nerve, also called as vagotomy, right? Also by this, the neurotransmitter peptide YY, and the gastric emptying is also inhibited by the tear, right? And the factors that will stimulate the gastric emptying, they are: one is the hormone gastrin, and other one is the excitement, right? So this, the hormone gastrin and the excitement, they will increase the gastric emptying, right? So this is all about the gastric emptying, right? So thank you very much for watching this video.